focus on the government's net zero policies and governance. Just as this committee has a remit to scrutinise government's performance across all departments against our commitments, the Secretary of State can be seen as the voice in Cabinet most responsible for ensuring that all departments are reminded of their responsibilities towards the government's commitments, and we will look to understand how that is carried out in practical terms and how it's going. Now, Secretary of State, before we go into the detailed scrutiny of the COP29 talks, can I ask you to lay out what you see as the national and international context that your department's policies sit in, please?
Well, thank you very much, Chair. And can I say that it's great to be with you today, and the EAC plays a really, really important role in scrutiny and accountability of government and has done over the years, so I look forward to working with you. So we lead the government's clean energy superpower mission in DESNZ. It's the foundation for our work at home and abroad. The Clean Power mission has two limbs. It has clean power by 2030 and accelerating to net zero or meeting our carbon budgets. And it's really important to say this by way of opening, Chair, that this is one of the Prime Minister's 5 missions because we believe it's the route not just to tackling the climate crisis, obviously very important, but also the route to energy security, to lower bills and good jobs and economic growth. Energy security because we start from the cost of living crisis that so many businesses and families have been through, which showed the dangers from our exposure to fossil fuels. Jobs and economic growth because we see the clean energy transition as the economic opportunity of our time. And indeed, this government sees no contradiction between net zero and economic growth. We believe they go absolutely hand in hand because net zero is a major contributor to growth, can be, and the climate crisis is the biggest long-term economic threat our country faces. And of course, climate doesn't need explaining why this is really important for our department. I think it's important to say for your work that this is a mission that we lead but is championed across government, starting with the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. And I would also argue, and this is very relevant to what we've tried to do in our first 6 months, that all of the evidence about our national interest says we should speed up, not slow down. Geopolitical instability continues to put pressure on energy prices. We need to go all out for clean power. The economic opportunities are going to go to those who lead, not those who hang back. And on climate, most recently in Los Angeles, we've seen the climate crisis is real. And here, I was doing this job before in 2008, but it was then talked of as a future threat. It is now a present and real. And we now know that in 2024, temperatures exceeded 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. I think that what is interesting, and I'll come on to some of the challenges in a second, is that despite all the difficulties, many other countries recognise tackling this issue is in their self-interest too. I saw that at COP29, and perhaps we'll get into that. But I think we should also be candid, and I should be candid to this committee, that the climate consensus at home and abroad is under greater strain than it has been for some time, and that is a crucial context for our discussions. In fact, there are siren voices in the UK who are saying we should step back from this agenda, that now is the time to give up on climate action because it is not in our national interest. And I think this is a massive fight about the future of our country. And I want to be incredibly clear with you about this. This government is not going to do that. We're not going to step back. We're not going to heed those siren voices. We're going to step up, in fact, and we're going to lead, not follow. And why? Because whatever the disinformation, the misinformation, the truth is that climate action is essential for our national self-interest and is supported by the British people. And I'd say finally, Chair, that I think we've been at our best as a country when we've reached across parties to take climate action, and that's in a way the spirit of this committee. The Climate Change Act that I piloted through in 2008 was supported across parties. My old sparring partner, David Cameron, was a big, my future sparring partner then, was a supporter. Theresa May legislated for net zero. Alok Sharma played an outstanding role as president of COP26. So we want to build as wide a consensus as we can. And I think we need people from all political parties, business and civil society, to make their voice heard, because there is no question this is a fight. I hope these reflections are helpful and look forward to your questions.
Well, they are, and I'm sure people will question you as we go through this session on the extent to which they are backed up by the actions the government takes. Now, going into COP29, you'd said that it was a chance for Britain to show global leadership on the environment and on climate change. Can you explain how the government approached these talks and how you feel they went?
Yes, well, thank you. So the way we put it is that we can only have energy security at home if we become a clean energy superpower, and that is in the interest of today's generations. But the truth is that we can only have climate security for future generations if we act with others. And it's really important to say this as a starting point. We're 1% of global emissions. Now, some people would say that's an excuse for inaction. I actually think it's an instruction to global leadership, because only if you work with others can we tackle this problem, and future generations will look back at us and say, were you the people who just didn't get it, who knew about the scale of the problem and didn't act, or did you act? So we went to COP29 very much in this spirit. I think it's really important the Prime Minister personally chose to go. Some other world leaders didn't go. And we announced an ambitious new NDC for 2035 of at least 81% reductions. At the G20 following COP29, following his visit to COP29, the Prime Minister launched the Global Clean Power Alliance, which is about countries coming together across the world to speed up the clean energy transition. We reaffirmed the UK's commitment to 11.6 billion of climate finance by 2025-6. Was a previous government commitment that we were honouring. I mean, overall, so there was what we did. Overall, I would say that COP29 wasn't Copenhagen, which was the last summit at which I represented the UK, which ended very badly. And it was really good that we got this $300 billion commitment over the line of public and mobilizing finance for developing countries. We finally got agreement on Article 6, which is around carbon markets. That's been a decade in the making. We didn't get an agreement on building on COP28 and the transition away from fossil fuels. And to be frank, we didn't get an agreement because lots of developing countries and small island states, in common with us, thought that what was on offer was inadequate. And we weren't willing to backslide from where we had got to at the UAE in COP28. So it was a mixed bag, but I'll be honest.
So what you're saying on emissions is the reason we couldn't get any commitment at all was because the only agreement we would have got would have been an inadequate one?
Well, the specifics of this are, and this is a debate we're going to have in the run-up to COP30 in Brazil, is how do we take forward the UAE consensus and the global stocktake? In particular, there's a lot of interest in paragraph 28, which is about the transition away from fossil fuels and the trebling of renewables by 2030. And the feeling of developing countries and progressive developed countries was that the agreement was just not strong enough to be assured that that work would be taken forward, and it'd be better to wait for Brazil to, if you like, pick up those discussions and make sure we can get an ambitious outcome.
So that was a yes to my question, was it? That the answer the reason we didn't get an agreement was because the only agreement we could have got would have been in
Correct. Correct.
Excellent. So why do you? I mean, I understand what you're saying about the developing countries. Why do you think there wasn't enough people in the room willing to set an ambitious target?
Well, look, on this transition away from fossil fuels, this is the hardest yards of these negotiations, because you're asking countries to change the way our economies have been run for 200 years.
Sure, but not overnight. I mean, we've spent 15, 20 years getting to this point.
Understood.
It would be reasonable to say that there was sort of profound disappointment at COP29 on emissions in comparison to where we were just a year or so ago.
I agree with that. And, these things tend to go in cycles. So COP28 represented, I think, quite unexpected progress, and I think the UAE presidency deserves quite a lot of credit for that, for having driven it forward on the transition away from fossil fuels. But saying that is one thing, operationalising it is another. And look, I think it's interesting because in one sense it was disappointing that we didn't get a better agreement, but as you know, Chair, the COP operates by consensus. I think.
Can you give us a sense as to who were the blockers in the room?
I don't think it would be diplomatic for me to sort of talk about individual countries in this context, but I think the point I was going to make was, look, the centre ground of these negotiations does want ambition. if you think about small island states that are in danger of disappearing, if you think about so many developing countries that are worried about their future, and so I think that there is there's opportunity, there is real opportunity to take this forward in the run-up to COP30 in Belém.
Okay. Now, in what ways do you feel that, you know, the UK led at COP29? What can you actually point to that you would say wouldn't have happened if we hadn't provided that leadership?
Look, we were working. I think I'd say this. I'd answer this at two levels, because one, people might be wondering, well, what impact does it have? The Prime Minister going to announce an ambitious target and all of those things. The impact it has is the power of example really matters in these negotiations, and giving you the authority to negotiate for ambition. And just let me unpack that. When we passed the Climate Change Act in 2008, it was then copied around the world. There are something like 25 countries that have equivalents of the Climate Change Committee. We were the first. So clean power by 2030, you know, as we strive to make that achieve that, I think we'll look for other countries will hopefully, if you like, be inspired by our example. And it also gives you the authority to negotiate, because people can't say, well, hang on a minute, you're saying one thing abroad, but you're doing another. And then specifically on the negotiations, you know, I did my bit, you know, sort of 2 nights of ish without much sleep and all of that jazz, which comes with these things. I would also say we have an absolutely brilliant team of civil servants. And the respect for our team of civil servants, one of the head of our negotiations, Alison Campbell's just being poached by the UN, she's so good. But, you know, we are absolutely in there at the table, a trusted partner, arguing for ambition, pushing further, trying to find ways of bridging gaps in the negotiations. And I think it's right that that's our role. And
I mean, on that sort of question of those sort of speaking for the UK, it was reported that the UK included 20 fossil fuel lobbyists in its delegation to COP29. Firstly, was that true? And if so, does that sort of undermine your attempts to promote the UK as this kind of climate leader?
Look, I think I'm not aware of that.
You've not heard that?
I hadn't heard
claim
that.
before.
Look, the truth is that there are some people who come as a part of our team of civil servants, and there are other people who get passed as part of the UK. I don't know.
A civil servant and a fossil fuel lobbyist are a different thing. I mean,
I don't know. I don't know. I can write to the committee about that. I'm not aware of that.
But I mean, would you agree there?
I'd be very surprised if we were doing that. I'd be very surprised.
So accepting that you're not certain on that, would you agree with me if it was true that within the UK delegation there were 20 fossil fuel lobbyists, maybe your colleagues will be able to answer that, would potentially undermine the sense that we were there providing
That's not what we're doing. That's not what we're going to the negotiations to. Look, and the other thing, look, let me just sort of say in this context, you know, we are a government that committed our manifesto to new licenses to explore new fields. This is a world-leading position. I don't think there's any doubt about UK leadership on this question.
Okay. I mean, I don't know if either of your colleagues can confirm or deny that claim, or
I think we'll write to you about it. Why don't we write to you about it?
I mean, I can come in and say that we, part of the UK delegation, did include businesses, academia, devolved administrations, overseas territories, a range of different parties. But those who were part of business were either ones that were supporting the pavilion itself or were part of events that were at the pavilion.
Right. Okay.
I mean, honestly, Chair, it's like this is genuinely a non-issue. People recognise around the world and in the UK, we're going to this with a very, very ambitious agenda, including on fossil fuels.
Okay. Thank you. Julia Buckley.
Thank you. What role can the UK play in international climate action now that President Trump has once again pulled the US out of the Paris Agreement?
I suppose my position would be this, which is we want as many countries as possible in the Paris Agreement. I do think it's quite important to say something, though, about the atmosphere at COP29, and I know some members of the committee will also have been there. This is an unstoppable transition. This is genuinely an unstoppable transition because countries recognise it's in their national interest to do this. I mean, I just give an example. I don't think China does everything right on these matters. but they also installed 277 gigawatts of solar last year. By anyone's measure, that is absolutely huge. I think it's as much as the US has installed of solar in their whole history, and that's just one example. So, and the mood at COP29 was, President Trump had been elected. He was then President-elect Trump. The mood at COP29 was very much countries coming with their national self-interest and moving forward. And I think we will continue to move forward. And look, we will seek to find common ground with the new US administration. Renewables investment actually went up in the first Trump term. So, as I say, I want as many countries as possible in the Paris Agreement. I think it's a really, really important agreement. But I think we can also, this is an unstoppable transition, not going nearly fast enough, but it is unstoppable, and we can seek to find common ground with the new US administration.
Thank you. And so in the absence of the US, if China takes on a more prominent role, what scope is there for constructive UK collaboration with China to achieve good climate outcomes for the UK?
I suppose the truth about this on China is there is no solution to the climate crisis without China, because they represent such a huge level of global emissions now. And, this is a point my US friends, Democrats and Republicans make. And so, of course, part of what we have to do as a UK government is work with China, among many other countries, to drive forward climate ambition.
Okay, and turning to the EU then, the UK does have an obligation to cooperate with the EU on both climate trade, international obligations, and what work are you doing with the EU to push that forward around these shared international objectives?
I think it's a really good point. Wopke Hoekstra, who was the EU representative at the talks, and I worked incredibly closely along with John Podesta, who was the US envoy, along with Brazil, obviously the future hosts of COP30. And I think, where these talks have succeeded best is when you have developed countries that want ambition, or blocks of countries, working with the vulnerable and developing countries who see the existential threat to drive that forward. That was very much what didn't happen at Copenhagen, what did happen in Paris. I think to an extent it did happen a bit in relation to this finance goal, the NCQG at COP29, and that's what we're doing. So relations with the EU are really important in this.
Do you think it's an opportunity for closer alignment of some of our environmental standards?
I think there's a separate discussion, sort of, if you like, separate from the COP process, about how we can work with the European Union for our economic benefit, including in these areas around energy. But I think the reality of the negotiations is that absolutely it's crucial to these negotiations that we work incredibly closely with the EU.
Okay, and then finally, what are your international climate leadership priorities between now and COP30 in Brazil, and how do you plan to achieve them?
I think two or three things I would say. Look, first of all, it's important not to forget, this is the year when countries are supposed to will be submitting their nationally determined contributions for 2035. This is going to tell us how far off track from 1.5 degrees we are going into the future. So I'm going to be going to India next month, working with other countries. I'm obviously already in touch with the new Brazilian presidency. So working with countries on how you can have an NDC campaign to request, urge the highest levels of ambition, point number one. Point number two, to follow up on the outcomes of COP29, including on this crucial, and I know the committee's looked at this, 1.3 trillion roadmap for developing countries. So the 300 billion is, if you like, the core. And then one of the things that came out of COP29 is working on this roadmap to 1.3 trillion. And this is really so much part of the answer, because public money does play a role, including through the MDBs, multilateral development banks. But also, how do you mobilise private finance? You know, this is the big change from when I was last doing this job. Now, for the majority, by some estimates, for the significant majority of the world, new renewables are cheaper than new fossil fuels. But that's true in theory. But if you're a developing country that has only a very high cost of capital, you're not going to be able to do that. So mobilising private finance to help those countries to make the transition, that's absolutely crucial. I think the City of London could play a really, really important role. So they're two big priorities.
Thank you.
I think we will come on to some more detailed questions on that. It sounds like quite an ambitious agenda for the next COP, and you're going to need some support with that. So will you commit to including parliamentarians from relevant select committees in the UK delegation to COP30?
100%.
Thank you.
100%, definitely.
Definitely better than
The passes. The passes are on their way to you now.
Great. Martin Rhodes.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, you have mentioned the ambitious NDC for 2035. Just want to ask a couple of questions about the detail behind that in terms of when are we likely to see that, in terms of what's the timetable for that plan? Will it be in terms of adhering to the best practice guidance set out by the UN, its Framework Convention on Climate Change?
I'm sure. On the latter, I'm sure. Maybe Lee would like to sort of say something about that, but I'm sure that will be the case. It will be the case. Good. On the first question. So, what's interesting about this, a bit of cross-party consensus, which might be a bit unexpected. I mean, I'm going to say Boris Johnson for a second. He legislated in 2021 for the carbon budget 6 for 2035, and it was actually a really pretty ambitious target. What we've done, so lots of the groundwork for what the Prime Minister announced at COP29 was really, it's basically the equivalent target to what was in carbon budget 6, 78%. It's 81% in the UN terms. And so, you know, that's the basis of the NDC, and we will be publishing later on this year our carbon budget delivery plan for carbon budget 6, which essentially underlies the NDC. I think we're also submitting in February, or quite soon, as part of it, there's a sort of UN process as well, but I can write to you with more detail on that. So that's the basic timescale.
Okay, thank you. And in terms of those plans, how do you plan to ensure that they align with the UK's and domestic and international goals in relation to biodiversity and nature?
Well, I mean, it's absolutely crucial to us that biodiversity and nature is aligned with this. And in fact, nature-positive solutions are an absolutely crucial part of meeting our carbon budgets. I mean, perhaps we'll come on to this. But, you know, peatland restoration, tree planting, you know, sustainable forestry, all of those things, you know, this is such an important point about nature and biodiversity, which is nature and biodiversity are massively under threat, but also nature-positive solutions are a crucial part of actually meeting our carbon budgets. And it's something that we are working very closely with DEFRA on.
Could I just,
Yeah.
I mean, that is the essence. So DEFRA are responsible for that contribution. They are part of our, sort of overall net zero strategy domestically. And so we work with them very closely to understand what they're going to deliver as their contribution. But as Secretary of State said, to make sure that the solutions we're doing for other sectors are nature positive. Okay. So we have a very good relationship with them. And of course, from an international perspective, our ODA, our International Climate Finance, has a significant amount of money on related to forests. And Matt can say more about that, but you know, there's a very strong connection between the two sides. And then the only thing I would say, Secretary of State hasn't mentioned it yet, but we have Rachel, Kite and Ruth Davis, who are the new nature and climate special representatives. So again, sort of bringing those two things together, because you're absolutely right, they need to be linked.
Thank you. And you've mentioned there in terms of working across with other departments, in terms of achieving those ambitious targets of the NDC, a lot of those policy areas will have devolved elements in terms of the devolved nations and administrations in the UK. How are you working with them to ensure that we put together the plan to deliver on this ambitious set of targets?
Yes, so we do work very closely with them, and in fact the CCC, as you know, is across UK, so supports and provides advice to the different administrations. We have regular meetings, both at director level, DG level, and we have a ministerial grouping that meets every so often to make sure that we understand where we are collectively in relation to the UK targets. So we do have a good relationship with them, and you know, as I said, work very closely on, I suppose, the macro position, but also on some of the detailed policies as well.
And it's been a big part of what I've tried to do in the last 6 months, which is to have, and it's been led by the Prime Minister, which have a very different approach to devolved administrations. But I think we can learn masses from each other and work close. You know, there are lots and lots of issues which, frankly, cross governments, and we've not only had the formal meetings, but also quite a lot of informal contact as well.
Thanks. Bring Ellie Jones in for a moment there, and then we'll come to Barry Gardner.
Thanks, Chair. Hello, Secretary of State. You've talked about the 81% NDC commitment by 2035. Could you clarify if international aviation shipping emissions were included, what would the UK's emission cut be by 2035?
Well, I think that's a 78. I mean,
it is.
Yeah,
exactly.
So the difference essentially between the 81% and the 78 is excluding international aviation shipping in the NDC. There's a small adjustment for including the overseas territories and crown dependencies.
But I do want to be very clear about this. You know, in our carbon budgets, we include international aviation. In our carbon budgets, we include international aviation and domestic aviation, indeed. And that is the way we think about our carbon budgets and our targets. The only reason why the NDC was submitted on a different basis was because that is the UN as the basis for the UN submission. So that is that is not government policy. Government policy is to include aviation in our carbon budgets.
Yeah. So to clarify, the reason for the difference between 78 and 81% is purely a number crunching reason. It's not a substantive reason. Indeed. It's just about what's included in the numbers.
Indeed.
So on the point about including international aviation and shipping emissions within our carbon budgets, as you pointed out, under the previous government, it was agreed that that would be done. But in order to operationalise it properly, secondary legislation needs to be brought forward, as I understand it. That was promised back in 2021 and has not yet been done. Can you confirm when you will bring that secondary legislation
that's recently
forward?
been drawn. This has been drawn to my attention. I just want to give you an absolutely categorical assurance that all of the discussions and the basis on which we operate as a government are to include aviation within carbon budgets. I think it's also right to say the carbon budget delivery plan the last government published, it didn't go so well for them, but also included aviation as part of it. I know there's a formality that needs to be gone through. We'll come back to you on the timing, but it's going to happen.
Could I press you slightly, Secretary of State? I mean, it's a formality. It's it's a fundamental piece of legislation which has been missing in action for 4 years.
It won't be missing in action for long. Can
you give us a timescale, Secretary of State?
I'll come back to you on the timescale, but I can absolutely assure you it's going to happen.
Can you give us a timescale for when you'll give us an answer on the timescale?
I'll come back to you shortly on the timescale, but it will happen.
Barry Gardner.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary, can I just say that going to COP this year, it was a real pleasure to have so many people coming up to us and saying it's just great to have the UK back at the table. So I want to open
Answer that.
Well, I just want to open with that because I think it really has shown that other countries have appreciated the fact that the government has set off absolutely front foot from day one. I want to ask you about the new collective quantified goal. You'll be only too aware that it will require a trebling of the previous target to achieve that 300 billion in climate finance every year by 2035. I want to ask you, how is the UK going to be contributing towards that? And specifically in relation to that, will it be predominantly grant funding or loan funding? And if it's loan funding, will it be concessional loans or non-concessional?
Let me answer that. The scale of the UK contribution in the years ahead, as you know, Barry, will be determined as part of the spending review. And so, if you like, the global goal was set as part of COP29, but the detail of individual countries' contribution comes after. I think, though, you raise a really, really important issue, and this is very striking to me in the negotiations, which is the quality of finance is as important to developing and vulnerable countries as the quantity of finance. In particular, the role of grants, not just loans, the issues of how quickly access to finance can be got, and also crucially, whether there is proper finance for adaptation. As well as mitigation.
I think
so,
the last year that was quantified, 69% of developed countries' climate finance was actually in the form of non-concessional loans, which is pretty bloody useless to many of the countries, if you'll excuse the phrase, Chair.
Yeah, and look, I think that there is a lot of detail in the agreement, actually, which was there after discussions with many developing and vulnerable countries about these issues of quality of finance, and they are something that we are taking really seriously. And actually, just to say about Rachel Kite, she has incredible experience from the World Bank and is playing a really, really important role on that. But I think it's really well taken.
Okay, well, look, let's start talking figures, because under ICF 3, International Climate Fund 3, which is ring-fenced in our ODA, we have 11.6 billion currently, which is allocated for climate-related ODA, right?
Yeah.
Now, within that, as you know, because I wrote to you just 2 weeks ago about it, there is a separate ring fence, which is for biodiversity, or nature, the nature-based solutions that you were talking about earlier, which is for 3 billion. Now, if we were seeing, and I'm not trying to predict what's going to happen in the spending review, but what I am saying is that we have signed up to a package which is saying there should be 300 billion a year by 2035, which is a tripling of what has previously gone before. Now, whatever is reflected in the spending review, one way of trying to maximize the amount of money that goes through from this country is if we can leverage private sector and philanthropic funding against what we give. Germany's done it with their Living Landscapes Fund. The US just legislated for it in December to have their international...
Sorry to interject, but is this through public finance mobilising private and philanthropic finance?
Indeed, but specifically around that ring-fenced element of ICF 3 at the moment, which is 3 billion, whatever that translates to in ICF 4, I'm not trying to interfere with your discussions with Rachel here, although in other areas I might be keen to. But here, whatever that turns out to be, if we could designate it for an international climate fund in the way that Germany and the US have done, we can actually leverage many more billions into it. That's been shown by what they've done. I did write to you about it, along with 32 other colleagues, 4 of whom are select committee chairs, many of the people around this table. And it would be good to know that this is being taken seriously by your department, by DEFRA, and by the other departments involved.
Well, look, this is obviously a very detailed sort of set of questions, but it sounds like exactly the kind of creative solutions that we need in this area. Sort of taking up taking seriously how we do this scaling up is obviously crucial because we have to bridge quite a big gap here. I think one of the things, I didn't say this, Chair, but one of the things that actually this process has yielded is a big stepping up by the multilateral development banks. I had a meeting with them in New York about making sure they stepped up. They set out their own target, which was really good for 2030, which showed the way they could scale up. But Barry, why don't we let me, because it's a real level of detail, as I would expect, let me take it away and we'll come back to you.
Well, look, one final thing then, and that is you were good enough to talk about the importance of cross-party working. You praised previous leaders of the Conservative Party and indeed Alok Sharma, who did an excellent job. In 2020, or 2022, I think actually, he put a marker down against the Mozambique LNG project, which is, I think, a major risk to the UK's international reputation. This is about UK export finance. It would be producing the same emissions as the EU produces in 1 year. It's mired in issues around human rights as well. Can I ask you to have conversations with the Secretary of State for Business and International Trade to ensure that we do not tarnish the good reputation which I started off by talking about having regained at COP29 by providing the 900 million of export credit that this was slated for.
Let me take that away.
Again, please, and then perhaps you could write to us about that, because I think if we're going to show leadership, it has to be across the board, and this is one way in which I think other countries would look and say, well, they do it if it's in their financial interest.
Thank you. Blake Stevenson.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, the new collective quantified goal target is a stretch target of 1.3 trillion of climate finance per year by 2035. How feasible is it that the 1.3 trillion target will be met on time, if at all?
Well, it's interesting because I have some sort of history in this, as in a number of things. So I was part of the setting of the 100 billion goal, along with Gordon Brown in 2009, and the 100 billion goal was met late, but it has been met, with some of the problems that Barry has talked about. It's stretching the 1.3 trillion. I think it's broadly consistent with the Stern-Songway report. I think they had a higher public finance number, truthfully. But they recognised that there was the need for this scaling up, and we just need to give it our best shot because it's crucial for the reasons that I've said. And in a way, I think it's really important to say that this isn't about simply saying, oh, well, we can only provide this amount of public finance and the rest will have to come from private. It's a reality that we need to find ways in which we work with the private sector so the private sector actually delivers investing in developing countries in renewable energy, among other areas, because otherwise we're just not going to help make this transition work. So, it's hard. The route map is important. The Global Clean Power Alliance is going to play an important role in supporting this, and we've got to give it our best shot.
And do you think the 1.3 trillion is likely to be enough to enable the recipient countries to respond and adapt to the impacts of climate change?
I mean, look, it's a number which is derived from I think from the Stern-Songway from the Stern-Songway report. So that was the number that they set out, the independent high-level expert group. All of the evidence is that the climate crisis is accelerating and the needs of vulnerable countries are greater. But this is a very, very substantial sum of money. So, we've got to get on with the process of making it real. And that's the trust issue here between developed and developing countries, are these promises going to actually be kept? I think it's good we set the 100 billion goal. I think we wouldn't have got to 100 billion if we hadn't set the goal. I think it was a forcing mechanism. I think this is another forcing mechanism.
And how are you planning to ensure that the UK's recorded contribution to international climate finance commitments is expressly linked to climate relief initiatives rather than broader humanitarian commitments?
Well, this is something that we are, I think it's good that we fulfilled, if you like, the promise of the last government around the 11.6. We're proud of the work that the ICF does, and we're completely committed to ensuring that, when we put forward resources for climate, they are indeed for climate purposes. And I think it's also important to say, by the way, that one of the things that we did as part of this agreement is, for the first time, multilateral development bank flows from countries like China are now going to be included in the 300 billion. Now that is quite a big change from where we had been, and I think it's good, and I think it reflects the changing economics, the changing situation. So absolutely, we want high integrity in the contribution we put forward.
And earlier, when Barry was asking questions, there was a conversation about public versus private, and you may not want to go into too much detail, but what do you think the public finance contribution is going to be?
From the UK? Look, that is a matter for the spending review. And remember, the way this works is, we have a development, an ODA budget, and the climate contribution comes out of that ODA budget. So, the work is obviously with the Treasury, but the work is also with the Foreign Office, and it's worth saying that Annalise Dodds and David Lammy are really big supporters of this agenda.
If I could,
Yeah.
just in terms of process, there is a cross-government process going on now, which FCDO chair, to make sure that we are all joined up and can put coherent advice to our sets of ministers ahead of the spending review on this process.
Thank you. Alison Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Secretary of State, for coming along today. The next section is on climate adaptation. So if I could just ask, the UN Environment Programme puts adaptation finance gap at between $187 billion and $359 billion US dollars, that is, per year. But adaptation outcomes at COP29 were limited. How urgent, therefore, is the need to get adequate global adaptation finance in place, given the immense finance gap there now is?
Well, I think it's a really important question, and it goes to the thing I was saying to Barry earlier, which is, I think, part of the challenge here is that adaptation finance has tended to be underfunded compared to mitigation finance. That's been a big source of, understandable anger, and there were important commitments made as part of COP29 about making sure that we scale up adaptation finance as well as the overall global total. Now, the needs of adaptation are just absolutely massive. I mean, the needs across the board are massive. But I think that there is a good basis for making sure that as part of the 300 billion, adaptation plays more of a part in that overall sum.
Thank you. Will the government be revising and strengthening the third National Adaptation Programme in light of the criticisms outlined in the Climate Change Committee in their independent assessment last year?
This is about domestic adaptation.
Yeah.
Yes, and it is something that we are working on across government. As you know, it sits in DEFRA, but we obviously work closely with them on that. And it's something that we are very much looking at, and will be, and it's going to be a big a focus of what we look at in relation to the spending review.
Can you say, or have you thought yet, if there's a particular process that will be followed, and if there's any timescales associated with that?
I mean, look, a lot of this sits in DEFRA, and it's obviously not directly part of the carbon budgets process. But it is certainly something that I talked to my colleague Steve Reed about, and something that we are determined to work on together.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. So we come now to the second section of today's session, looking more generally at net zero and the seventh carbon budgets process and governance more generally. Now, and the previous Prime Minister agreed that effective delivery of policies to achieve the sixth carbon budget had been hampered by a lack of pre-legislative scrutiny. And his administration committed to allowing this committee to play a key role in the scrutiny of proposals for the seventh carbon budget. Is that commitment still in place under this government, Secretary of State?
Yeah, I absolutely think this committee has got a central role when it comes to Carbon Budget 7. As you know, Chair, Carbon Budget 7 will be coming out. The recommendations from the Climate Change Committee will be coming out next month. And I just want to sort of put on record that I am determined and completely aligned on the idea that we need a process, that this committee has an important role to play, that we support Parliament having a proper chance to debate these issues and having the proper information to make the decisions around Carbon Budget 7. And I look forward to this committee, if you like, kicking off the process. As you know, the deadline to legislate is June 2026.
So just to clarify, is that commitment that was made still in place, or are you suggesting a different approach?
Well, the commitment to proper information for Parliament to debate these issues is absolutely something we endorse and we want to happen, and we will make sure it happens.
And how do you envisage select committees sort of contributing in terms of parliamentary scrutiny of that?
I think, Chair,
proposal?
I think, Chair, that the Climate Change Committee will be coming out with its recommendations very shortly. Government will then undertake a quite complex cross-government process in advance of the deadline of June 2026 to set out its response. But I think in the meantime, I would really welcome your role in scrutinising the recommendations of the Climate Change Committee, kicking the tires on what they are saying, and it would significantly help us. And I would, if you like, see it as a really important part of the process of scrutiny that Parliament does.
Yeah, well, great. And so, as you say, the Climate Change Committee in February will be making their recommendations. When would you anticipate that we would hear the government's own sort of expectation?
Look, sufficiently in advance of the June 2026 deadline that Parliament will have a proper chance of scrutiny. I'm not going to put a date on it today, but I think it's fair to say that government needs to have a thorough examination of the proposals that come out from the Climate Change Committee, and I would envisage that taking some period of time. Because this is a very significant set of recommendations. It covers 2038 to 42.
I mean, my birthday is in August the 12th. Do you think I might have it in time for that?
I think we will. Well, look, my instincts are we'll need a bit longer than that. We've got our carbon budget delivery plan, which is going to be coming out later on this year. I think we'll need a proper process of cross-government scrutiny of these recommendations.
And will the government publish its own delivery plan in terms of how these are going to be achieved alongside its proposals for the seventh carbon budget, or will they come later?
Well, look, the Act envisages, the Climate Change Act envisages that the publication, if you like, of the carbon budget delivery plan after the setting of the budget. I think we can get hung up on the terms here. I think that Parliament needs enough information from what we say to make an informed judgment about whether what we recommend, following the CCC's recommendations, is the right thing for the country. So I undertake that we will do absolutely what is necessary for Parliament to make that judgment.
And so, just to clarify, if I've understood you correctly, what you are suggesting is that the Climate Change Committee announcement should be the sort of
trigger,
starting gun for this committee.
Exactly.
And that we will then subsequently, at some point in the latter stages of this year, maybe or maybe not in time for my birthday,
probably not in time for your birthday.
What else could I want?
We'll think of another birthday present for you. no, I think that's absolutely right. And I think what you say about this committee playing an incredibly important role in this process of scrutiny, and I genuinely welcome it.
Thank you. Ellie Chowns.
Thanks, Chair. Just to follow up on that, so clearly we've got an important role in scrutinising what the CCC advises, arguably an equally, if not more important role in scrutinising what the government then proposes, both as carbon budget and as delivery plan. So will you commit, Secretary of State, to coming back to this committee after you publish your carbon budget proposals to answer questions from us before laying it before the House?
Sorry, just explain what you mean by before
before bringing
I think
the
this
carbon
is
budget.
I think look, let me come back to the committee on the precise chronologies, but I definitely commit to coming back before this committee to discuss our proposals.
Great, thank you. And can you commit to ensuring a debate in the full House of at least half a day on the proposed?
I think there should definitely be a debate in the House. My understanding about this last time, just to give a bit of clarity, is that the government put down an SI proposing carbon budget 6, and we supported it. And so it went through. I mean, it's sort of a slightly odd position the last government got itself into, which is, they blame the government for not having a proper debate. Well, they were the government. So, yeah, I'm happy to do that.
And, I mean, is it not the case that part of the reason this has been an issue is the lack of a delivery plan to match the carbon budget, such that we've ended up in a situation where we've got targets where the government's plans have been found to be woefully lacking to meet them, which arguably suggests that it is really important, even though the Climate Change Act doesn't specify it, it's actually really important for the government to come forward with that clear delivery plan to go with the carbon budget 7, so that we can know how we're going to get to our goals, because the goals without a plan to reach them may not be very effective.
Well, yes. But look, let's just get to the sort of truth here, which is the last government set the targets and then didn't do the work, right? And so we've come to office, and I'm glad we've got onto this, with only 1/3 of the reductions necessary covered by credible plans according to the CCC. Now, I'll just be honest with you, we faced a choice. We could have said, well, look, the last government has left us in the lurch, so let's downgrade our targets. That wasn't the choice we've made, because I think that'd be the wrong thing for the country. But you're absolutely right. We are now running to catch up with what we've inherited. I think whether it's about the process as to what happened, I'm not sure that's really the case. I think the only other point I'd make is, look, in 2026 we will be 12 years away from the beginning of the carbon budget 7 period. So I think we just need to take away and think carefully about what is the right level of information we can provide. I think it's got to be enough information, absolutely, that Parliament can make an informed judgment on these issues. But when exactly we get to the carbon budget delivery plan, we'll come back to you on.
Okay, thanks, Secretary of State. So as you've pointed out, you inherited a woeful situation in which there are completely inadequate plans for meeting the existing targets. In that context, and specifically referring back to what you said in answer to the very first question relating to COP29, which was people can't say you're saying one thing and doing another, would you agree that major infrastructure investment decisions or permission decisions, such as, for example, airport expansion, should not be taken before we get the forthcoming advice this month from the Committee on Climate Change, and that such policies, such as airport expansion, are, as the Committee on Climate Change previously said, incompatible with meeting the targets we already have?
Well, let me answer this sort of carefully, because I think it's sort of important. I think it's important, and I will go into a little bit of detail on this, if I may, Chair, because this is really the heart of the matter on one of the most important issues on aviation. So on aviation, the way I've always thought about this is our goal is neither on the one hand to stop people going on holiday, stop the economy getting what it needs on the one hand, nor is it business as usual as if climate change is not a problem, right? And I think that is a sensible middle ground of this debate. And to make that a reality, we have a system in this country of carbon budgets. And so it's really important to say this. Any decisions about airport expansion take place within that framework. That is a legally binding framework passed by the 2008 Climate Change Act. And this government is committed to upholding the rule of law. So any decisions on aviation expansion must be made within that framework. And any aviation expansion will only be able to go ahead if it is consistent with our carbon budgets.
And the Committee on Climate Change in its previous advice said that airport expansion was not consistent with our carbon budgets.
What the climate change...
What's changed?
What the climate change's progress report said, that no airport... They said that no airport expansion should take place without a UK-wide capacity management framework. And look, I absolutely agree with the CCC, and I want to be absolutely clear about this, that any aviation expansion must be accounted for as part of carbon budgets. On their balanced pathway, there was a 25% increase in passenger numbers by 2050.
Which is within existing airport capacity.
Now, we have a range of mechanisms to make sure that any aviation expansion is consistent with our carbon budgets. I actually think maybe it doesn't look like it, but I think we agree about this, which is any aviation expansion must be justified within the framework of carbon budgets. And I can absolutely assure you that is the position of the government. And that is the basis, without anticipating anything that might be announced or might not be announced, that is absolutely the basis on which the government stands.
In that case, Secretary of State, given that aviation expansion will increase emissions from the aviation sector, which sectors are you suggesting should contract their emissions even further in order to accommodate any proposed airport expansion?
Well, look, that is a specific question about the pathway of aviation emissions, and that depends on a whole range of factors, as you will know, including the use of sustainable aviation fuel, airport efficiency, and what other decisions are done. I think, but I think I just want to sort of provide this reassurance, because you've made a really important point. Carbon Budget 7 comes out next month. That will be very, very important, because that will give a greater sense of the pathway for framing decisions the government makes. So I just want to sort of provide this element of reassurance to you, which is 100% any aviation expansion must be justified within carbon budgets, and if it can't be justified, it won't go ahead.
Thank you. So one final question on this. Just very briefly, based on what you've just said, Secretary of State, does that mean the government will make no announcements on airport expansion until that advice from the CCC has been published next month to provide that framework?
I'm not going to get ahead of any announcements that might or might not be made, but I want to give you this very strong reassurance that the government's position is very clear, which is, and it goes back to the conversation we had earlier, aviation expansion, if it happens, where it happens, must be justified by reference to carbon budgets. And it goes to this broader point, Chair. I think it's really important to make this point, which is we are absolutely committed to growth as our number one mission. We are also, because it's part of our mission, shared across government by the Prime Minister, by the Chancellor, we are absolutely committed to making good on our mission around not just clean power by 2030, but accelerating to net zero and meeting our carbon budgets. And that is a whole of government commitment.
Thank you. Olivia Bellick.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome, Secretary of State. I wanted to just ask about something that's happened today. So today, Cornwall Insight has released a report that government is going to miss its 2030 clean power target by 32 gigawatts, equivalent to tens of millions of homes worth of power. Do you recognise that figure, and do you agree with the report's conclusion that we're off track?
No.
Okay.
Let me just sort of be a bit more expansive than that. Look, I think I would.
We value brevity here.
You do value brevity, okay? But I mean, let me just be not so brief. Look, the NESO, the National Energy System Operator, provided us independent advice, saying, it's really hard. Of course, it's hard. The 2030 clean power. If it was easy, the last government might have done it. It's hard. It's really challenging. But it's doable, and it's absolutely the right thing for the country, for our energy security and for climate and so on.
Okay, so looking at the delivery of clean power and the oversight of that, there are many bodies at the moment, including Mission Control, NESO, Clean Power 2030 Advisory Commission, the Clean Power Mission Board, the AI Energy Council, and your own department. Who ultimately has responsibility?
Well, I am responsible for delivering clean power by 2030. I lead the mission. It's the first limb of the 5 missions of the Prime Minister. So I'm sort of accountable to him for delivering this. Within our department, we've set up something which I think is a really important body, which is Mission Control, led by Chris Stark, who was at the Chief Executive of the Climate Change Committee. This learns from the Vaccines Task Force. I talked quite a lot to Patrick Vallance about this. It's outsiders, civil servants working together with a clear mission to drive through government. And if you think about the pace we've moved at, I won't give you the long list because of the interest of brevity, but we produced our Clean Power Action Plan within 5 or so months of coming to office because we're determined to drive this forward.
Okay. Just to drill down a bit more then, how are you avoiding overlap and duplication amongst all these organisations that have got oversight?
I actually think that the danger is less duplication and more sort of silos.
Yeah.
And I think what's good about the Clean Power Mission Control is it, if you like, brings together all of the work in my department on which is relevant to clean power. And then we're also well served by the mission boards. I chair the mission board for our mission. Deputy chair is the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Pat McFadden. And so what's good about that, and again it learns a bit from the Vaccines Task Force, is if there are blockages across government, the mission board is a really good way, working with the Cabinet Office, to break down those barriers and to sort of superpower this forward.
It sounds like you feel that something would be lost with the suggestion, but would it not be easier to run the whole mission out of your department, working across government and with stakeholders as necessary, rather than the situation we've got? Or it sounds as though you don't agree with that.
So look, we run the mission out of our department, both limbs of the mission, but and I just want to be so absolutely clear, in case it's not clear, that's absolutely the case. Look, it is also the case that, and I know this is, you understand this, it is also the case that we are reliant on working with lots of other parts of government. And look, I'll be frank with you, I think we are doing fantastically in terms of cooperation. If you think about planning reform, that's been a crucial part of it. If you think about skills, I'm working very closely with the Department for Education on making sure we've got the skilled workforce to deliver this. I'm working closely with the Business Secretary on some of the industrial aspects of this. So I actually think there is good cooperation across government, and I think we have good mechanisms in place to make it a reality.
Is there anything that you would improve?
I think the truth is it's moving at speed. It's moving at speed and that's what we've tried to do since we came to office. Lifting the onshore wind ban, consenting all the solar, the renewables auction, the Clean Power Action Plan. All of those things are about speeding this up. And I think there is something interesting in contrast to Cornwall Insight, which is, I think 2 years ago industry was very sceptical about whether this was achievable, 2030 clean power. I think the mood has changed. Talk to the National Grid, talk to the NESO, talk to others, and they're like, well, yeah, it's really hard, but it is achievable. And I think that does show the galvanizing influence that you can have by taking action and moving quickly.
So you think Cornwall Insight have got it massively wrong?
I do.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
John Whitney.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, Secretary of State, following on nicely. A key part of the government's approach, as you've already stated, to delivering net zero is the Clean Power by 2030 mission. How would you respond to the National Energy System Operators' contention that delivery of key elements of that plan are at the limits of what is feasible?
It's really hard. They're right that it's really hard. It's really hard. I think it's really interesting this. When we came to office, there was no plan for clean power, never mind by 2030, by 2050. We're taking a very different approach. Just be very brief on this. So we're setting out how much of each power source we need, which is set out in the Clean Power Action Plan. And that's a new thing. Nobody's done that before. We're restructuring the grid queue on the basis of, well, look, if you're relevant to 2030, you're going to get good treatment, preferential treatment, but we're going to deliver what we need, including by region. We're orienting planning reform to delivering 2030, including by making it part of the national policy statement, the energy national policy statements. And then we're fashioning, as I said, the skills strategy, the supply chain strategy. We're doing something, what I call plan and build, not neglect and delay. We are taking a much more intentional approach to this because it's hard. And if we don't do it, we're more at risk on energy security, we're more at risk on climate. That's why it's so important.
Okay. And with that in mind, I think I know the answer to this question, but so is it realistic to think that all the elements of this mission can and will be delivered simultaneously and at pace?
Yeah, yes. And I am absolutely convinced of that. And we set a deliberately stretching target. I think it's partly basically my experience. If you set a target 15 years away, maybe it goes back to some of the conversations we had earlier on. If you set a target a long way away, it doesn't exactly increase the pressure to deliver. There's a massive virtue in this because it is driving progress through government. It's driving industry to think, well, these people are serious. Let's invest in Britain. It's driving decisions on the next contract for difference or AR7. And that's what's important about it.
And as clean power by 2030 is a core element of delivering net zero, is there a plan B for net zero if we don't hit all the clean power?
Look, I'm convinced we can do it. It is important to net zero, but I'm convinced we can do it. I would also say, and maybe we'll come on to this, we've got to do clean power by 2030, and we've got to do lots of other things as well to deliver our carbon budgets. And by the way, this is what's really interesting about this. Look, electricity demand is only going to grow. 50%, something like 50% by 2035, maybe doubling by 2050. We're entering the age of electricity. And the question is it going to be clean electricity or not? And so that's why I always say to people, some people will disagree with me. They'll say you shouldn't have done 2030. But you're going to need all this infrastructure anyway. Yeah. Because of the scale of the need. We're moving to a very different system, a much more electricity-heavy system. So this infrastructure, everything we're doing is needed, so whatever exact position you take on this.
Thank you. Anna Goldberg.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome, Secretary of State. We've touched on the importance of the upcoming spending review, and the National Audit Office has recommended that environment and climate considerations be embedded into that forthcoming spending review and into departmental business planning processes. How are you ensuring that net zero considerations will be embedded into the decision-making processes in that review, and in particular for rural areas like South East Cornwall with older housing stock and a high proportion of off-gas homes? They face significant challenges to decarbonisation. So how will you ensure that no areas are left behind in that process?
So there's two parts to that question. On the first question, it's very much part of the spending review process, and I know that from talking to the key secretaries of state and indeed working with Rachel Reeves and Darren Jones, the chief secretary, that we want this to be a mission-oriented spending review, and that the missions get really important priority in this spending review, and that has been a sort of clear message from the centre to secretaries of state, and I know also from my discussions with, as I say, with other secretaries of state, how important, they recognise the importance of this and the need to do their bit. As I said earlier, look, given the inheritance that we've got, this is hard. I mean, 2030 is hard. This is pretty hard too, because of where we're starting from. But that is very much a priority for the spending review. On your question about those off the gas grid and so on, I think we've got to be looking at creative solutions here, and we will be publishing plans later on this year around our warm homes plan, and I think it's fair to say this is going to require quite big change in the way government does things. I think it's about a much bigger role for mayors and local authorities to help delivery, because I think the record so far is that they've been better at delivering. I think there needs a proper process of advice and guidance for consumers about how do they navigate through this kind of thicket of confusion. There needs to be proper regulation and audit to make sure that when work is done, it is done properly. So, and absolutely, we need to ensure fairness when it comes to rural and urban areas.
That's really welcomed to hear. And as you're working to ensure that it's embedded within that spending review, how are you working to embed net zero requirements across all departments as well? We've heard that you're working in a joined up approach, but it'd be good to hear more about how you're working with all departments ahead of that.
So I think what's interesting, Lee wants to come in, but I think what's interesting about this is that this is maybe not as widely known as it might be. There are what we call effort shares for each sector. It's by sector rather than department, just for sort of obvious reasons of interactions. And that is quite an important, and this is an inheritance from the last government, that is quite an important guide for Secretaries of State to know where am I in relation to my effort share, how far behind am I, what do we need to do to catch up. So, this process is quite embedded. Look, it's definitely hard for the reasons that I've set out, but it's definitely embedded.
No, I mean, you're spot on. I was going to say the same thing. So this is an established sort of pathway that was set out in the Net Zero Strategy published in 21 and sets out a pathway to Carbon Budget 6. So each department has a set of responsibilities. They're required to have a set of plans underneath that. So Secretary of State said it's hard, but that way of working is very well established actually. And as I said earlier, we have a lot of engagement because ultimately the Secretary of State is responsible under the Climate Change Act for saying whether we have a plan or not and where we are in relation to our carbon budgets. And so it all feeds into that process. So, and that applies both in terms of just the carbon accounting, but also in relation to our approach to the spending review to make sure that we've got a cross-government position on understanding the decisions that are made to support the measures in the plan.
Thank you.
Thank you. Pippa Halings.
Thank you very much. Secretary of State, you said in your response to the Committee on Climate Change's progress report on 2024 reducing emissions that this mission-driven, mission-led government was key to tackling, the greatest global long-term challenge, which is the twin crises of climate and nature. And different to what we've had before, which is about the carbon budget, and you have each of the sectors having to say what we are, the climate and nature crisis puts an additional framework on that, and perhaps a challenge, which it was good to hear what you said to the Committee on Climate Change, and then last Friday we had the Climate and Nature Bill, which is a private member's bill, came forward, and it was therefore consistent to hear you committed in that, in a cross-party way, to rebuild this political consensus, that you will be bringing an annual statement to Parliament and the country on climate and nature. And one is just to reaffirm that commitment. And then, if so, how would that integrate and breach the gap at the moment between the carbon budget delivery plans and the environmental improvement plans? What is your thinking so far, and how do you think those can be taken together?
Well, look, I actually would, in the interests of sort of engagement and learning from this committee, I'd be interested in your advice and thoughts on this. So, I'll tell you what my thinking, and I want to pay tribute to Ros Savage and her co-sponsors for the work she did. One of the co-sponsors is in the room, I think.
And me too.
And you too, right. No, but tribute to both of you for the important initiative. So the thing I felt on coming to office was we have all this information in my department about the climate crisis. There's a huge amount of information about the nature crisis in DEFRA, but we don't really tell the country about it. The Met Office issues a report on climate once a year, which gets a bit of coverage in The Guardian. And so my intention, and genuinely I'd welcome your guidance on this, my intention is there should be an annual moment where we say to Parliament, look, this is what we know as a government about the scale of this crisis. But also, crucially, I think this is what we're doing as a government, but also this is what you can do as the public. It goes to this public participation issue, which I think we need to do more on. And so that's the thinking behind it. But obviously I want to take advice from a range of people about this. But I suppose I feel I sit on this information in my department about what's really going on, and I hate to say it, but how bad things are and how quickly things are moving. And I think I've got a responsibility to tell the country about it.
Well, I think we would welcome that as the committee, so being able to engage in the future on that and about how that's taken forward. And it's both yours and, as you say, the State of Nature report and the need to not only say what is the state, but what are we doing about it. And as I'm saying, therefore you've got the environment improvement plans and the carbon budget delivery plans, suggesting that we need to look at how those two, which is what the Climate Nature Bill was trying to do, is saying that they have to look at how they integrate, you know, where they cross over. Perhaps that leads to the next question, which would be, I think there is consternation, having heard about the mission-led approach, cross-departmental, is that there will be announcements, you know, by the Treasury about deregulation, about disempowering regulatory bodies to take away red tape, which could be environmental safeguards, which could be high carbon actions. In what way do you see that this climate and nature commitment is not just in DESNES and DEFRA, but is across all departments? And because you have the effort share because of the carbon budget, but not within nature, how can we make sure that this is for all of those? Because, as you say, they're inextricably linked.
Look, I think it's a really important question. I think this is shared across government, this sense of mission. And, you know, I actually think, I'll come to nature in a second, because I think it's really important. I think when you think about clean energy and economic growth, or net zero more broadly in economic growth, you know, speeding up our energy infrastructure, the building of our energy infrastructure, clean energy infrastructure, is really, really important and a big driver of economic growth. And I also think, this is the other thing I was going to say about nature, I actually think this can be done in a nature positive way. I mean, I genuinely do, actually.
But you aspire that, but we're taking away all of the regulation and safeguards.
Well, I think we have to be slightly careful in I'm not sure that the headlines can sometimes tell a sort of different story to the truth. I don't think that I wouldn't accept that characterization. Look, I just think, you know, when you think about how do we build offshore wind, but do so in a way that actually it does so in a nature positive way. There are ways to do it, and we're thinking about the funds that can make that happen, including the developers playing a part in that. When you think about solar, which is controversial in some quarters, you can also combine that with nature positive solutions as well. I think what is a fair challenge is my department is a energy security and net zero department. Nature sits in DEFRA. And it's your question is a really important reminder that all the time we've got to make sure they're integrated. I'll give you one example of that. We've got Craig Bennett, you know, well-known champion of nature, in the Clean Power Unit as one of the Clean Power Commissioners, working with Chris Stark to, if you like, be a check and a sort of balance in making sure that what we're doing on clean energy is done in a nature positive way.
So can I, and finally, just on that, in terms of, as you say, it's taking everyone with us, and it's a national conversation. At the moment, that political coalition, together with the environmental movement, have been ready to step up to those roles. I would say, at the moment, there is this moment of consternation, I would say, within the environmental movement, given the announcements that are about to come out. What ways can be done to ensure that there is honest and productive relationship to rebuild this political consensus that we need cross-departmental, cross-party?
Well, look, I take very seriously working with business, working with civil society, and working with people across parties. You know, I'll just be honest with you. You know, I'm not sure this is the kind of thing you normally say at a committee, but, you know, I lost the election in 2015, some of you may remember, and, you know, one of the reasons I'm still in politics is I care so much about this issue, but I don't have a monopoly of wisdom. And I think it's just incredibly important to reach out across parties, but also across civil society, and to hear the voices of those groups. You know, I don't always agree with them, but who advocate on behalf of nature, for example. We had a good dialogue when I was in opposition. It's also a dialogue I've continued when I've been in government. And I think the British people really care about these issues.
They do. They do.
Thank you. I mean, just on that, I mean, really welcome what you say about the need to have a sort of a candid discussion on nature with the population, and this sort of idea of a kind of annual moment. Now, we had just recently the Office for Environmental Protection report, which except was a DEFRA responsibility. But after that pretty stark report, we got no statement here in Parliament from your colleagues. The previous year's OEP report was only responded to by the government in the very last week that they had a statutory responsibility to do so. So it does feel like there's a kind of disconnect between your desire as the DESNES Secretary to have this candid discussion and actually what the government's doing in terms of, you know, fronting up that discussion on nature when it has opportunities to do so. This government came in July. They took 6 months from that to respond to the previous report. They haven't had a statement on this year's report. Do you see the disconnect between what you're saying and what we're actually seeing?
Well, look, I'm not aware of the details of what you're talking about. I would say my colleague Steve Reed is really committed to this agenda. He's working on something really important, which is the land use framework, which people have talked about for year after year, and it's actually going to happen quite soon. I think that's really, really important. I mean, I'll speak for myself, Chair. You know, I want this annual statement to be a statement to Parliament, so that Parliament and the public, you know, look, there's so much of a sort of blizzard of noise that people are subjected to, but I think there've got to be these standout moments when people kind of get a sense of a kind of honest appraisal of government, of where things are at, what we're doing, and what they, as I say, and what they can do. But, you know, I'll be frank with you, this is a sort of an idea which I discussed with Rod Savage and others. She was keen on the idea, and we talked about it on Friday. But you know, I'm interested in, you know, good advice about how we can make this really.
Well, I mean, wouldn't the publication of that Office for Environmental Protection annual report be an ideal moment to do that? And can I suggest the government sort of consider that?
We'll look at that. We'll look at that.
Thank you, Chris Hinchcliffe.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary of State, some final philosophical mopping up from my side, I think.
As if we hadn't become philosophical enough. As more people are leaving, you know, it's like people are leaving the stadium.
Perhaps quite rightly. You have repeatedly said that we can meet our growth mission and keep within our carbon budgets. Given that since 2015, global GDP growth has been associated with an increase in carbon dioxide equivalent emissions every single year, apart from in 2020 during COVID. And the Energy Institute's latest annual review of world energy showed a new record in the consumption of fossil fuels. What discussions have you had with the Chancellor and others across government on the maximum environmentally sustainable GDP we can maintain?
Well, look, here's the interesting thing, Chris. You cite global figures, and I'm sure they're right, but if you look at the UK, I don't have the figures to hand, but there has been a massive and stark decoupling of economic growth from carbon emissions. Yes. I mean, we haven't grown nearly as much as we could have done as a country, but while there has been economic growth over the last 30, 40 years, there's been a very rapid, 50% broadly, reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions. That tells you it can be done. Well, I don't just make one this point. I don't think our offer to the world or to the British people can be, look, we can't grow anymore, because that will mean people's standards of living will fall. I think our message has got to be, we can grow, but we've got to do it in a way, consistent with the drive to net zero. And I think we absolutely can do that.
Okay, well, I think, Secretary of State, you would know as well as I that whilst there has been technical decoupling within our own economy, that our demands have an impact on resource consumption overseas. It has an impact on land use change overseas. It leads to overseas industrial activity. So I don't want to get drawn into this too much, but if it's the position of government that infinite exponential increases in consumption of resources on a finite planet are possible.
I'm not sure I'd put it that way. But, you know, look, even on consumption emissions, even if you take account of our consumption emissions, our emissions have gone down So in other words, it's measured. The 50% is measured on the basis of production emissions, but if you look at consumption emissions, it's also fallen. Look, I'm not saying this thing about your infinite thing that you said, but I don't think. I think that the people who care about this issue are going down a blind alley if we're saying to people, look, we just can't grow anymore. Particularly if we're saying to people, well, people in the developing world and in Britain, I've got to say.
Okay, so to move on to a specific point,
yeah.
the Chancellor of the Exchequer is recently reported to have said that growth trumps everything. Does the work of the Growth Mission Board take priority over the Clean Energy Mission Board?
You know, I saw the way that the Chancellor was quoted on that, and she's since made it clear that she believes that the two are absolutely consistent. She's been, I'll be frank with you, she's been one of the biggest supporters of the Clean Energy Mission and net zero. You know, she has put it at the centre of her philosophy about how our economy grows. So, the whole of the government, and we've had a, you're not supposed to talk about these things, but we've had a joint meeting of the Growth and the Clean Energy Mission Board, precisely because of the way in which we see the two as going together. So, honestly, we see the two as absolute. Going forward to 2030, and then they've got assessments beyond that, but there's obviously more uncertainty beyond that. They believe it absolutely can be, when you look at the scale of the demand, it absolutely can be accommodated. But I think the reason for the setting up of the AI Energy Council is precisely so we can have a proper assessment of the demands and where they're going to be in the country, look at how those can be met, and ensure, and this has maybe got less attention, that the role of AI in making our energy system more efficient can be properly used.
Thank you. A final point, I take that the name is the AI Energy Council, but in your discussions around the resource demands of AI and data centres in the future, do you have discussions around water resources as well, given the pressure on our water resources in this country? Is that something that is being considered within those discussions?
The council is just sort of getting going, so we'll we'll make sure we look at that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. I mean, just on the question about the airports, I think the DFT analysis 2020, I don't imagine it's changed hugely, said that the expansion of Heathrow would mean a shift of 27,000 jobs and 42 billion pounds in GDP from other regions to London and the South East. As the MP in Doncaster, for Doncaster North, if it's still called that, you have obviously, I believe, supported the plans for Doncaster Airport. Were you sort of in despair when you heard this sort of announcement around Heathrow expansion, or do you really feel that it doesn't undermine what you're trying to achieve?
You're very tempting, Chair. I've always thought that, but you're not going to tempt me into speculation on this question about Heathrow.
But you're not sort of leaping to defend it. You're choosing not to answer.
I'm not going to look. I think there's obviously public debate on these questions, but the government will make its intentions clear at the appropriate moment, and I don't think it's helpful for me to speculate on it.
But you're still supporting the Doncaster expansion.
Yeah, and look, it goes back to the point I made earlier, which is, and I've always thought this, including 15 years ago when I was last doing this job, which is there's two edge positions, which is, people should never be flying. We can just carry on with total business as usual. And I subscribe to neither position. The right position is, and this is the CCC position, this goes back to the question earlier, is to have this within a framework. I might add, by the way, that when we were having these debates previously, it's relatively recent, going back to the question earlier, it's relatively recent that the aviation, including international aviation, is actually included in carbon budgets, and I think that was a positive step. But it's got to be accounted for within that framework.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Ellie Chance, finally.
Thank you, Chair. Three brief questions, two following up on Chris, but one just prompted by your question there, if that's all right, Chair.
We're in injury time,
Secretary of State, would you... Given the discussion that has just been prompted again, would you support the introduction of a frequent flyer levy as a policy situated in between the two extremes?
I'm really sorry, I'm not going to... These are matters of tax policy, and they're definitely not matters for me. They're matters for the Treasury.
Arguably highly relevant to your portfolio, but we'll move on. In response to a question from Chris, you talked in glowing terms about the decarbonisation of the UK economy over the past 30, 40 years. Of course, you will be super well aware that that is in very significant part due to a one-off and unrepeatable decarbonisation of the electricity system as we have moved away from coal and increasingly away from other forms of fossil fuels. Therefore, it's arguably not a good demonstration of the principle that economic growth can be decoupled from emissions. Indeed, in a number of sectors, notably transport, that has not happened. Could you comment on the areas of the sectors where you are most concerned about the struggle to decouple emissions from growth?
I mean, look, I think you make a really important point. I mean, I suppose it's less glowing terms because I think no country has done enough. It's more just making the point about decoupling. But the truth is that the power sector has seen significant fall in emissions, but the rest of the sectors we've significantly underperformed.
Exactly.
Industry, agriculture, buildings, transport, and we've got to do better. I 100% agree with you. We've got to do better. And, just to sort of say, when you think about what this government has done since we came to office, we've restored the ICE phase-out date of 2030. We've made big advances in investing in carbon capture and storage. We've made big investments in hydrogen. We've taken action on a warm homes plan. We've changed the heat pump 1 metre rule. So, we absolutely do see it as our job, my job, working with other secretaries of state. It's hard, but to drive up what we do, drive up performance, drive down emissions elsewhere across, other than in the power, not just in the power sector.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And finally, you made reference to consumption emissions versus territorial. We use territorial in the debates on carbon budgets and so forth. In particular sectors, there's quite significant differences. do you feel that we don't pay enough attention to consumption emissions, and what shifts would you like to see in the way that the UK measures and addresses emissions, recognising the sometimes significant difference between consumption and territorial?
I think you're right. I don't think we do pay enough attention to them. Now, the UN framework that we sort of work within is done on the basis of production emissions, partly because of issues of national sovereignty. But I think it's right, and actually in relation to Rod Savage's bill, it's one of the areas that we said we would look at. And look, and also, you know, it's also part of the kind of industrial side of this, because we don't want to, we definitely, you know, my view is that decarbonisation is the route to re-industrialisation, not de-industrialisation. And therefore, you definitely don't want to sort of export your emissions simply to other countries. I don't have an answer on this, but I definitely think it's something we should be taking more seriously as we think about the policy landscape and policy decision making.
Well, Secretary of State, Ms McDonough, Mr Toombs, thank you very much for your evidence today and the full and candid way in which you've responded to the questions. Very much appreciate your attendance. And with that, we will bring this sitting to a close. Order.